Welcome on behalf of the Watson Institute. My name is Wendy Schiller. I'm the interim director of the Watson Institute and a professor of political science. And on behalf of Rabbi Josh Bolton, the Watson Institute, and Hillel at Brown, would like to welcome you to this conversation with Dr. Einat Wilf as part of our series on international events and particularly the Israeli-Gaza conflict. I do, as a matter of course, public events now at Brown, have to read our protest policy and some other sort of mechanics for this talk, which will be live streamed, and we are recording it, and it will be on the Watson website. In addition, as you think of questions you'd like to ask our speaker, you've been given pencils and index cards. Please fill out your questions, and we'll have some folks come around and collect them so we can ask them when she's concluded with her remarks. So, our protest policy at Brown. Protest is a necessary and acceptable means of expression within the Brown community. However, protest becomes unacceptable when it obstructs the basic exchange of ideas. Such obstruction is a form of censorship, no matter who initiates it or for what reasons. Protests or demonstrations that infringe upon the rights of others to peacefully assemble, orderly protest, free exchange of ideas, or that interfere with the rights of others to make use of or enjoy the facilities or attend the functions of the university cannot be tolerated. Halting a lecture, debate, or any public forum is an unacceptable form of protest. Halting means directly or indirectly preventing a speaker from speaking, even for a brief period of time, or seizing control of a public forum for one's own purposes. The university, Brown University, must be a place where ideas are exchanged freely. By asserting their rights to protest, individuals cannot decide for the entire community which ideas will or will not receive free expression. So we appreciate your alignment with these policies. So, Dr. Einat Wilf is a leading thinker on Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, and education. She was a member of the Israeli parliament from 2010 to 2013, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committees. Born and raised in Israel, Dr. Wilf served as an intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and a strategic consultant with McKinsey Company. Dr. Wilf has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. She was the Goldman visiting professor at Georgetown University. Dr. Wilf is the author of 7 books that explore key issues in Israeli society. We Should All Be Zionists, published in 2022, brings together her essays from the past 4 years on Israel, Zionism, and the path to peace. The co-authored The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace, was published in 2020. So please welcome Dr. Einat Wilf.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. It's my first time at Brown, so I'm really pleased to be here as your guest. What I thought I would start off the conversation this afternoon is to look, to borrow the phrase, at the gathering storm, and to look at 2 elements that I think really point to a great moment of peril. I want to address the 2 prisms, one that looks at the Palestinian ideology and its supporters over the last century, and the other about if I can make up a word, the respectabilization of anti-Zionism. So first on the Palestinian ideology and its supporters for the last century. A bit of background about myself. I grew up in Israel. I grew up in a political and social environment in the 80s and 90s that was very much associated with the Israeli peace camp, with the Israeli Labor Party. At the time that I'm growing up, the Israeli Labor Party has moved from its emphasis on socialism to increasingly its emphasis on making peace. And the idea is that there is finally a path to peace for Israel based on a very compelling and simple formula that was known as land for peace. The idea being that the peace that eluded Israel when it was born, right? When Israel is born, declares independence, none of its Arab neighbors are willing to make peace with it. At most, they're willing to sign armistice or ceasefire agreements. So the notion is that after the victory of the Six-Day War in 1967, with the territories that Israel captures in that war, its enemies, its neighboring countries will understand that there is no defeating Israel militarily. They will thereby sue for peace, and Israel can sweeten the deal using the territories that it acquired in war. And that increasingly becomes known as the Land for Peace formula, which for a while seems to work very well. This is the basis for the peace agreement with Egypt, where Israel hands over the Sinai Peninsula in its entirety, signs a peace agreement with Egypt. We can discuss the content of that peace and to what extent it actually merits the name, but officially it's a peace agreement in return for land. The 90s is really the decade of land for peace. Israel negotiates with Syria over the Golan Heights, signs another peace agreement with Jordan when Jordan forgoes its territorial claim to the West Bank. And of course, the key element of the 90s is the direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. This is, in general, a decade of euphoria. Not just in Israel, it's a decade of global euphoria known by the name of the end of history. As I'm sure you know or you've learned, everything that seemed impossible happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. I don't know if you know, there was once a profession called a Sovietologist. The Sovietologist the day before said it was impossible. The day after, they said it was inevitable, and then they lost their jobs. But basically, this happened, and the Berlin Wall fell, and apartheid in South Africa came to an end, and Northern Ireland signed a peace agreement. It was a decade, really, that felt that everything that seemed impossible, intractable, was finally being resolved. And it made sense that it would also happen in our little corner of the world. Sometimes people today, especially in Israel, say, how could you be so naive? And I always have to remind people that it wasn't just us, it was a global mood of possibility. So this is when I can finally vote. I vote for every Israeli prime minister that is looking to put the Land for Peace formula to implement it. Rabin in 92, Barak in 99. I follow with great hope Barak as he goes to Camp David. Camp David is already symbolic. This presidential retreat is where peace with Egypt was negotiated earlier. And Ehud Barak, an Israeli prime minister, voted on this platform. Head of the Labor Party, head of the peace camp, proposes to the head of the PLO, Arafat, a Palestinian state, ending Israel's military presence in the West Bank and Gaza, the occupation. So to the extent that people say the occupation is the reason we don't have peace with Palestinians, that was going to be resolved. There were going to be no settlements in the state of Palestine. Those were going to be removed or exchanged for equivalent land. Then even Palestine was going to have a capital in East Jerusalem. A note on Jerusalem. I grew up in Jerusalem. When people hear the word Jerusalem, the image that comes to mind is what I fondly call Insanity Central, the 1 square kilometer of all the holy sites. Jerusalem, certainly since 68, is 100 square kilometers, mostly Arab and Jewish neighborhoods, nothing special, nothing holy like the one I grew up in. That was going to be divided. Jewish neighborhoods to Israel, Arab neighborhoods to Palestine. But even the 1 square kilometer of holy sites was being divided up: Temple Mount to Palestine, Kotel, Wailing Wall to Israel, Jewish quarter to Israel, Muslim quarter to Palestine. That was the level of detail that was being discussed. So Palestine was on the verge of emerging, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites, essentially check, check, check to everything that I grew up being told is what stands between us and peace, all that Arafat had to do was say yes, and he walks away. He walks away. This is followed up with a 4-year campaign of brutal violence that was misnamed the Second Intifada. But if you lived in Israel at the time, as I did, it was definitely the darkest time to be in Israel before October 7th. Just brutal massacre in our streets by means of suicide bombers. A poem, a song, a pop song from this time by Yehuda Poliker captures the mood. It said, Mi haba bator, mi bator haba, who's next, who's next? The sense was really, there was a palpable sense that if you left your home to go on the bus, to sit in a cafe, you are playing Russian roulette with your life. And this happens weeks and months after Palestinians could have had everything that we were told they wanted. So I begin to ask a very simple question. What do they want? Because they clearly don't want a state. They clearly don't want an end to the occupation. They clearly don't want an end to settlements. And they clearly don't want a capital in East Jerusalem. Or you could tell me, Einat, you're exaggerating. They want all this stuff. But then if they can have all this stuff, imagine a scale. And you put all these things on one side of the scale. There is something that they want so much more that again and again, they will walk away from this package for this thing. What is that thing? And during this time, I meet Palestinians. I'm invited to meet in various workshops, moderate Palestinians. I do the research that becomes the book, The War of Return. And I realize, to the credit of Palestinians, they've always told us what they wanted. We just didn't listen. Or when we listened, it sounded so outrageous that we didn't take it seriously, or we assumed that at the critical moment, they wouldn't really behave according to that. But they always told us. They said, from the river, from the Jordan River to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free. And to go back to the original Arabic, from water to water, Palestine will be Arab. So free is free from any Jewish sovereign presence. They always said that. To their credit, they've been consistent throughout. And as I do the research that becomes the War of Return, I come across a quote. And it's a quote that I've been using ever since because it's remarkable in that it captures the conflict in one sentence. It's by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. If you know anything about Ernst Bevin, a friend to the Jewish people he was not, certainly not to those who wanted sovereignty. And he needs to go to the British Parliament in February 47 to explain why Britain failed, right? Britain is entrusted unanimously by the League of Nations with a mandate, with a trust to help the Jews achieve sovereignty in their ancient homeland. Britain fulfills the trust to the Arabs. It creates Transjordan, Iraq, France creates Lebanon and Syria, but the Jews don't have their state. So he needs to explain why Britain failed. It got a trust from the world, and it failed that trust. So he needs to explain to the British Parliament why. And he says the following. He says, His Majesty's government is thus faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now, he calls it irreconcilable. In February 47, there's no settlements, there's no occupation, there's no blockade of Gaza, there's no Bibi, there's no Smotrich, there's no Ben-Gvir, there's no Arab refugees, there's no Nakba, there's no state of Israel. And already he calls the conflict irreconcilable. He goes on to explain. He says, in the land there are Jews and Arabs. The Arabs are the people who will one day be called Palestinians, but at that moment they're called Arabs. So he says, in this land there are Jews and Arabs. And he says each one of those groups has a top priority, the one thing they care about more than anything else. He calls it the point of principle. He says, for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a sovereign Jewish state in the land. Fine. So the Jews want to exercise the universal principle of self-determination for their people, for their nation, in their homeland. And then he goes on to say, and for the Arabs, again, those are the Arabs that will one day be called Palestinians. He says, and for the Arabs, the top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. Note that he's not saying that the Jews want a state and the Arabs want a state, and we'd love the UN to help us divide the land equitably. He says, as a matter of top priority, the Jews want a state and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. By definition, irreconcilable. And this has been the conflict ever since. The sides have always behaved in accordance with their top priority. In that sense, nothing has changed. This is why Arafat in 2000 and Abu Mazen in 2008, not to mention the partition plan in 47, but this is when Palestinian Arab leaders are faced with a choice. You can have your own state in the land, but the Jews will also have their state in the land. At least to date, that is an unacceptable proposition because it fails their top priority that the Jews will not have a state anywhere in the land. Now, I've been giving this talk for many, many years, and sometimes people say things like, oh, you've changed your opinions. You moved from the left to the right in Israel. Now, I'm still very much in the Israeli left on all issues, economic, social, religious, but also in terms of my continued willingness for partition in two states. And I always explain to people, I didn't change an opinion. It's not that I liked blue and now I liked red. It's empirical. We had a hypothesis. The hypothesis that was that what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state, is land, is dividing the land. It's a hypothesis. It had a lot to recommend it. It was tested. That's important. People like to erase the fact that it was tested. At least two Israeli prime ministers, Barak and Olmert, Rabin to a degree, but most important, Barak and Olmert tested the hypothesis. That was through the effort to reach an agreement. Arafat walks away in 2000, Abu Mazen walks away in 2008. Ariel Sharon, a right-wing prime minister, tested the hypothesis through unilateral retreat from Gaza and the northern West Bank. The hypothesis fails. So then I had to search for a new hypothesis that could explain the situation. The new hypothesis is that what stands between us and peace is the Palestinian ideology of from the river to the sea. Unfortunately, to date, all evidence supports this new hypothesis. It's not an opinion, it's empirical. So you might say, okay, this has been the situation for the last century. So what's special about this moment? And what's special about this moment is by looking at the prism, not just of the Palestinian ideology, but its supporters. Because the Palestinian ideology, I've come to call it Palestinianism, was always singularly focused on the prevention and ultimately the undoing of a sovereign Jewish state in any part of the land. What the Arabs of the land discovered already in the early 1930s is that the fact that they were engaged in a total war against Jewish sovereignty made them incredibly valuable for every anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist power in history. So in the 30s and 40s, they enjoyed a fruitful collaboration with the Nazis. Today, people find it highly uncomfortable, so everyone likes to pretend that Hitler and the Mufti just had lunch one day. But it was a full collaboration for years, with impacts on the ideology that lasted the present. And then the Nazis were defeated, but they were replaced by the Pan-Arabists that really turned Palestinianism into the secular theology of what it meant to be an Arab, and really made anti-Zionism for at least 2 decades the core of the Arab identity. And then the Pan-Arabists are soundly defeated, but again with a legacy that continues to today, and they are replaced by the Soviets, who really take Palestinianism and anti-Zionism global, inserting it into international institutions, the United Nations. Zionism is racism. They introduced that to the UN in 1975, and that establishes all the Palestinian structures in the UN. Even when Zionism is racism was repealed in the 90s, all the structures that it established remain. So the Soviet Union is ultimately defeated, and after the lull of a decade of the end of history, Iran becomes the main sponsor of Palestinianism. So the good news in all of that is I think I can say with a fairly high level of confidence that the Ayatollah regime will meet the same fate as its predecessors, the Nazis, the Pan-Arabists, and the Soviets. It will be defeated and head to the dustbin of history. In a hot war and a cold war, but it will be defeated. The bad news, of course, and that's what keeps me up at night, is that on the way to being defeated, on the way to the dustbin of history, all of these regimes have created tremendous damage to the Jews and some global mayhem. And the question is where are we at this moment? So this is one prism that leads me to believe that we are at a moment of peril, at a moment that brings together Iran as a supporter of Palestinianism and looking at the history of its predecessors. The question is, are we at the beginning of the arc of the damage, in the middle, or at the end? The other prism that leads me to believe that there is a moment of peril and gathering storm, and it is very much related to that, it is the growing respectability of anti-Zionism in academia, in international institutions, in the halls of Congress. Now, I've been following it for a while. I sometimes joke that Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union don't get enough credit for their contribution to spreading global Jew hate. But they literally wrote the book, right? Tsarist Russia writes the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Today, anyone can write a book and publish a book. It's not a big deal. But imagine 120 years ago, a book meant seriousness, meant respectability. So imagine the impact of a book that brings together all these myths, all these libels, and gives them the respectability of a book. It's not a coincidence that this is a book that has never been out of print, that has been translated to probably every language in the world. In the Arab world, for example, to the present day, it is not considered a forgery. It's considered a serious book that every serious person should study to know how the world is actually run. It's being given by serious people as gifts in order for people to understand what goes on. But of course, after the Bolshevik Revolution, and especially after World War II, when classic Tsarist anti-Semitism gets discredited, the Soviet Union begins to create anti-Zionism as its respectable mask. And what it does is it creates this ingenious equation that I've come to call the placard strategy, because you will recognize it from every anti-Israel demonstration on placards. What does the placard strategy look like? On the placards, you will see Israel, Zionism. Sometimes they just will draw Star of David, and then an equation sign. And the placard strategy has been so successful that you all know what's on the other side of those equations. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals racism, colonialism, imperialism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing. If you're in America after 2020, you'll put ethnic cleansing next to the equation sign. Then it escalates into Nazism, genocide. Now, the brilliance of the placard strategy of those simple equations is that it works like a repetitive nursery rhyme. And all these words are chosen not because they have any connection to reality. You need to spend 1 minute in Israel to know that. What they all share is that they are symbolic of evil. They connote evil. So essentially what people are exposed to is this repetition. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil. And the brilliance of the placard strategy is that it's not just on placards. It's in media, it's in social media. For years, you would put an anti-Israel speaker on television, on a panel. You gave them 30 seconds. Regardless of the question they had to address, they would say apartheid, ethnic cleansing, colonialism in the answer. It's in international institutions, right? Zionism is racism. That's a very simple equation, one of the shortest UN General Assembly resolutions. And why did Zionism is racism be brought to the UN? Because a while earlier, the UN General Assembly resolved to fight racism. So once everybody agreed that racism is bad, step 2, let's slap the new evil word next to Zionism. That's how it works. With the Soviet Union gone, again, but it left a legacy. The UN conference on racism in 2001 in Durban resolves that Israel's an apartheid. The South Africa continues the Soviet tradition, takes the case of the genocide to the International Court of Justice. Nobody cares what is resolved, what is said, as long as you can say International Court of Justice, Israel, genocide, the placard strategy achieves its goal. In academia, the idea of academic respectability was also launched by the Soviet Union. If the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was just a book, the placard strategy is a whole world of academic discipline. People get PhDs in that. They've exported it to left-wing circles. From that, it makes it to the West. You can get a PhD in Zionism as colonialism. You teach a course on Zionism as racism, and then that gets respectable. And I've been talking about this for many years. I've been following the placards. This is how I could notice that after 2020 in America, suddenly white supremacy gets placed next to Zionism. And I've been talking for years about genocide. How did I know, right? Supposedly, if genocide has to do with reality, there should have been no mention of it before the last year. But at least for a year, at least for a decade, there's been an effort to insert genocide next to Israel, Zionism, Star of David. So someone recently asked me, they said, okay, if you know what words are bubbling up, what's the next word? And I said, actually, we've reached the final station. And the reason that I know we've reached the final station is twofold. First, the word genocide was always going to be the ultimate word. First of all, because genocide is an ultimate evil, but also because there was always a particular need to blame the Jews for committing genocide as a kind of reversal, retroactive justification to what was done to them. And the other reason that I know we've reached a final station is that after October 7th, a new placard appeared, one that didn't appear before. And it said, keep the world clean. I don't know if you've seen it. You can look it online. It said, keep the world clean. And then it has the Star of David in the trash bin. And when I saw that placard, I said, bingo. Because this was always where the placard strategy was leading. Because if you create this repetitive rhyme, Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil. Well then, what do you do with evil? You eradicate evil, right? You fight evil. Here on your campuses, so many young people have their sense of identity wrapped up in doing good, right? That's who they are. They are people who do good. Well, there is no greater good than the eradication of evil, by definition. So if they are exposed from every direction, academia, media, social media, international human rights organizations, that Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil, then of course a good person has to be on the side of the eradication of that evil. And this idea of keep the world clean is one of the most ancient and most dangerous ideas ever, especially when it comes to Jews, because it posits that there's a clean world out there, a good world, a beautiful world, a world of utopia. It's not a coincidence that all the evil words are on the side of Israel, Zionism, Star of David, and all the good words are on the side of anti-Zionism, of Palestinianism, rights, freedom, justice, equality. So what is being posited here is that there is a utopian world, a clean world, a world of justice, equality, rights, and freedom. And the only thing that stands between us, this messy, dirty world, and this clean world is the collective Jew, which needs to be placed in the trash bin by any means necessary, which I'm sure you've also heard in the past year. So the coming together of this heightened respectability of the placard strategy of anti-Zionism, together with the supporters of anti-Zionism in the form of Palestinianism, leads me to believe that we are at a moment of gathering storm. So let me end here, and I'm more than happy to respond to any questions, beginning with you. And thank you.
So your final concluding remark, I will ask 2 questions, and then I'll ask Rabbi Bolton if he has questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And I have more questions, but I want to make sure to leave time. So for many Jewish Zionists today, the sense that Israel is the only safe haven for them, should they become unwelcome in the countries where they reside, has been undermined by the events of October 7th and the reaction of the world community thereafter to try to, in your argument, to continue to, but to try to ostracize Israel. Can you offer any reassurance to that community? And do you think that community even merits reassurance? Those people who are in the Jewish diaspora who don't live in Israel, and Jews of a certain generation, I'll count myself in that generation, who grew up with parents who lived in a world where there was no Israel and then there was an Israel. And the idea, particularly for American Jewry, was that such intense support was because there is a sort of strain in the Jewish diaspora that says you are unwelcome wherever you are, but that in Israel there'll be a safe haven. What do we do with that now?
Okay. So I think also the notion always of a safe haven in the sense that it's always safe was never the right one. And Zionism in general, if you look, you know them, the early Zionist writings, they're not so much writing about safety, to a degree, but they're writing with a whole revolutionary spirit, which is not just about the notion of immediate safety and security, but much more about the ability not to be at the mercy of others, which is a different notion than being always safe. So the idea of being sovereign, the Zionist revolution in Jewish life, was about finally being in a position where we are, to use the French word, chez nous. We are at our place. We are in a place where we are sovereign, masters of our fate, capable of defending ourselves. So I always thought that the idea of the promise of somehow absolute security and safety never had. We know there were always elements of not being safe. I talked about the Second Intifada, but we are at a century-long battle. In the pre-state years, there were Arab pogroms in the Jewish Yishuv. The notion that this was a safe haven in the sense that being always safe, I think that was a bit too much. It was always going to be about the place where we are at least not at the mercy of others.
And cannot be expelled. I think that's one of the things that, particularly on college campuses now, and thinking about the fate of the Jewish people in Israel, is that for the vast history of the Jewish people, they were always at the mercy of not just physical violence, but being expelled, as they were throughout the whole world. And so the idea was this would be a place, if you were Jewish, that you could not or would not be expelled.
And the one place where the doors will always be open. Of course, that is kind of in many ways a central trauma of it. There's the great comic writer Ephraim Kishon, satirist. He once said that when he came, he went through the Holocaust. When he came in the early days of the refugee camps, the Ma'abarot, he said, we all Jews came from countries where we were looked down upon. Here would be the country where we will look down on each other. So there was really this notion that this is a place where we are in our place. But what I will very much agree with what you said, I think this was the logic of the October 7th attack. We know that Sinwar, when he was in Israeli prison, he took 15 courses of the Open University. He took courses on the history of Zionism, the history of the Jewish people. So he knew that the Jewish people had a history in the land of Israel. He took courses about Israeli politics. And what he took from these courses is not to say, oh, the Jewish people have a history here. I should lead my people to a historic reconciliation in which they and us understand that we both have the equal right to self-determination in the land, where neither one can have all of it, but each will have some of it. Or he could have been inspired by Zionism to go back to Gaza and turn it into the Dubai of the Levant and really show what it could be. Rather than what he takes from his studies is a kind of almost diabolic understanding of the Jewish condition. And what he worked so hard to do on October 7th is to exactly strike at the heart of the Jewish sense of confidence, the Jewish sense of being at home, the Jewish sense of being able to defend themselves. And the writer Mika Goldman called October 7th a near-death experience for the state, a kind of a notion of what it means to be defenseless for a day, and what that, seeing that after having forgotten what it's like, what does it do to us? So I agree with you that in many ways, the question that weighs most heavily at this moment, both in Israel and for Jews around the world, is what does it mean to be sovereign? Do we have what it takes? Can we get back from this near-death experience? I agree. This is very much at the core of what the attack of October 7th was intended to achieve.
So I'll ask my second question, which is a question that has been very pervasive in a lot of discussions, academic, media. And I'll give you the shorthand question, which is, are there limits to the extent to which Israel can engage in warfare to defend itself? In other words, many people are now talking about sort of the idea of proportionate response in international law, and thinking about October 7th and the slaughter that happened on October 7th, and of course the rockets that come from Lebanon now, mostly documented from Hezbollah. So what are those limits? And is there an obligation for Israel to limit itself or confine itself to these rules set by the international community on the extent to which and how it defends itself?
So I will start by saying that Israel is not even close to coming to the envelope of those limits, and I'll expand on that. But before that, the question is always specifically asked in the Israeli context. I have a colleague, Dr. Shani Moore. He wrote a beautiful piece after October 7th. He called it a special dictionary for Israel. And it was about how certain concepts that were understood to have a clear legal meaning, like occupation, which fundamentally requires effective control, were deformed and perverted so as to claim that Israel still occupied Gaza after Israel left in 2005. How the issue of proportionality is completely abused and misused, and you need to get military experts to explain that proportionality is a case by case of every military attack based on the military target. But all these terms get deformed only in the Israeli context in order to, as Dr. Moore puts it, to save Israel from its victories, to kind of, sometimes I think that there's something very deep about the idea that Jews cannot be allowed to win, that there is something fundamentally wrong about a Jewish victory. It's against, I don't know, long civilizational laws of nature, if you could say that. But more specifically, just to understand what's going on in Gaza, because people often talk without just having an understanding. Sometimes people talk about what's happening in Gaza as urban warfare. This is urban warfare taken to the 1000th degree. What was done in Gaza is the weaponization of an entire landscape. It's not just some militants hiding among an urban population. They have spent over a decade, nearly two, taking the entire Gaza Strip. And this goes back to the ideology, right? Because contrary to these disappearing maps of Palestinian land, having control of Gaza is actually the first time that the Arabs of the Levant control territory. Israel in 2005, I was then working with Shimon Peres, he was working with Ariel Sharon. I remember the dramatic night when Ariel Sharon decided to get out of the border with Gaza. And Sharon's thinking was, we are going to leave them, no excuse. We're getting out of the land fully to the pre-67, it's not a border, but to the pre-67 armistice lines. We're gonna get all the soldiers, all the civilians. We're gonna take the graves. We're gonna get out of the border with Egypt. Even I remember Shimon Peres made an overture to the Palestinians. They tell them, look, we're getting out. Do you want the houses of the settlements? They're good houses. You know, a rational, constructive ideology would have said, sure, we're going to use them. The response that we got said, do not leave a stone over a stone, even al even, destroy everything. That should have already been our clue to how they view this moment. They wanted to see destruction. But Ariel Sharon, his idea, and we did that. We destroyed the houses. And the idea of the Israeli government under Sharon was, we're leaving them no excuses. In retrospect, what he and I and many others underestimated was the ability of Palestinians to make up new excuses, such as claiming that Gaza is still occupied. But this is the first time that Palestinians actually control territory. Do they say to themselves, wonderful, this is a strip of land with beautiful beaches, with sand from the delta, the Egyptian delta. It sits at the crossroads of two ancient trade routes. We're going to turn this into the Singapore of the Middle East, the Dubai of the Levant. Is that what they say? They say, excellent. We're going to use this strip of land as a launch pad to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. And they proceed to come up with an ingenious military doctrine that looks as follows. The entire Gaza Strip, you have tunnels that are connecting, 700 kilometers of tunnels that are connecting mosques, houses, hospitals, kindergartens. In all these places, weapons are stashed ahead of time. So this is something that was prepared for years ahead of time with all the billions of dollars of supposed aid for reconstruction flowing in. And this was done with the knowledge of a very supportive population. So all these hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, hundreds of piers connecting them. Recently, soldiers said it was so ingenious that some cases they had piers, and in some cases the piers they still left the floor and they didn't finish the pier, so that when people will look, they will not find a pier. And then 2 days later, militants come up because all they had is a little part that they left, and they open it up. So everything, all the weapons are stashed ahead of time, and except on their GoPro cameras where they wear uniforms, the rest of the time they're in civilian clothing. And they either go underground between those stashes or overground in civilian clothing. This is a whole military strategy that is ingenious. Now, we don't know the final and exact numbers, but we know enough to know that pretty much the ratio of combatant to civilian in Gaza is about 1-to-1. Given the Gaza landscape and the weaponization of all of it, a 1-to-1 ratio is unparalleled, unprecedented, and I would say even exemplary. But nobody talks like that. 5 years from now, and you can, this is recorded, 5 years from now, I can assure you there will be an obscure military journal that will explain all this, will explain how remarkable it is that Israel fought in this way, but no one will care anymore, because everyone had already said genocide and disproportionality and collective punishment and all these words, and then it will be 5 years from now. So Israel's not even close to operating at the envelope of what international law, and we will add to the fact that we are fighting against enemies that are not subject to that law.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Rabbi Bolton. Do you want to ask questions?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wolf. I have found it to be the case that Israeli Zionist academics, especially when, as you described yourself, just a little to the left, have tended to be some of the best readers of the American current moment and the Jewish American moment in particular. So I just have two questions. One, I was hoping that you would, open up a little bit more on the question of why respectability of anti-Zionism, particularly in the academic setting, why does it fit so perfectly here, and why is it the universities that we see this as the center ground?
I'm just going to repeat for the recording that the question is, how has sort of the respectability of anti-Zionism taken such hold at the university level?
Okay. So first I'll start from the other direction. Respectability is necessary for the spread of these ideas. Over the years, when I gave talks, especially to students, I found it very difficult to discuss anti-Semitism because everyone is very smug, thinking that they know that anti-Semitism is bad, right? I would never fall for these ideas. Everyone thinks, oh, I know that. And I always struggled to explain that when anti-Semitism rises in the second half of the 20th century, as the pseudo-scientific, respectable secular replacement for the traditional church-sanctioned Jew hatred, I always struggled to let them know that it was respectable when it emerged. It was written in books by scholars and academics. Theodor Herzl encounters it among his colleagues in the University of Vienna. So today, in this kind of retroactive ahistorical notion, people think, oh, anti-Semitism is the ideology of the deplorables, right? It's of the lower classes, it's of the fringe. We, the educated, would never fall for these crazy ideas. But that's the brilliance of anti-Zionism. You actually need respectability to breach the gates. So anti-Semitism was respectable in its day because it had this pseudo-scientific veneer at the time. And then when it got discredited, anti-Zionism was created as its respectable replacement. And why do you need respectability? Because otherwise it doesn't spread. If I may, nobody really cares what the Pope says these days. But what top universities in America say, that matters. They are in many ways the modern churches. They determine doctrine. They determine what's the right way to think and what's the wrong way to think. They excommunicate people. They reward those who think correctly and don't reward those who think incorrectly. So the universities, the international institutions, the human rights institutions, they are the modern churches of this moment, of this current ideology. So these ideas have to be laundered through institutions that give them respectability. It's not a coincidence. And academia really matters. This is why so much was invested in the idea that you get PhDs in those ideas. And what the Soviets did and exported is once you start referencing each other, it becomes a web that is impenetrable because you quote this person and they quote the other. And again, this becomes this kind of ever-expanding idea of its respectable scholarship, and you can no longer kind of unwind it. And you can see it. Young people would never, certainly young educated people, would never allow themselves to kind of fall for classic anti-Semitic ideas, right? They're smug. This belongs to the uneducated. But these ideas, Zionism is racism, white supremacy, ethnic cleansing, genocide, well, the International Court of Justice said it. My professor is teaching a course on Zionism is colonialism. So that allows them to feel that they are in a place that is worthy of their status, of their class, of their education. And that's how you breach the gates. So this is essential to the success of the spread of those ideas. And that's how it works. And so, yeah.
My second question is, you referenced the young people. So it's not lost on anyone that many Jewish students are involved in the anti-Zionist uprisings. And I wanted to ask you, what do you say to those students?
Okay.
So the question is that many Jewish students are involved in campus, did you call it uprisings? And so what can explain that?
Okay. So first, more broadly, this is relentless, and ultimately Jews are a minority, and many buckle under the pressure. I taught, as you mentioned, a course on Zionism and anti-Zionism at Georgetown. At the end of the course, one of the students came up to me and she said, "This course was more valuable to me than dozens of hours of therapy." And this began for me a very interesting conversation with her as to why was therapy even needed and why did the course provide it. And in the conversations with her, what really came out is that anti-Zionism operates with the dynamic of bullying. And that takes an emotional toll. Because if you look at the dynamic of bullying, right, the bully asks for your lunch money. You hand them your lunch money. Do they go away? No, they come back the next day for more. And the dynamic of anti-Zionism works in this way. It is relentless. Sometimes I describe it through organizations. When I was in college in America, I was active in pro-Israel activism, and I supported two states since the 90s, and that was great. And then there was J Street, and then there was J Street U, and then there was If Not Now, and then JVP. And today, if you're not the Jewish militant co-chair of Students for Justice in Palestine, you're just not a good enough Jew. It used to be enough to say, I support two states, or I don't like Bibi, and that would get you in the room. Today, the bullying dynamic is so relentless is that nothing less than complete exorcism ceremonies, where you make it clear that Israel is genocidal, apartheid, like you go through the placard strategy, only that gets you in the room, and even barely. So this takes an emotional toll. And ultimately, especially for young Jews who want to be involved in social justice and doing good, when they are subject to this pressure of this is the price of entry, many buckle. And when you say what to say to them, what I've discovered is basically say nothing, wait. Because all the young people that I've been working with, in the last decade at least, they all had a crossroads moment. I've described this dynamic, I called it the pound of flesh dynamic. Because contrary to Shakespeare, it's not the Jews who demand the pound of flesh. Historically, it's the Jews who are demanded to hand over the pound of flesh, sometimes real, but mostly metaphorically. To mutilate their sense of Jewish identity, to deny many elements of that. I sometimes watch with a certain sense of, I don't know, sadness, wonder, when I see like JVP trying to celebrate Jewish holidays without Israel or without Zionism, and they contort themselves into pretzels because you can't. And to deny, I mean, you could be like a Satmar Jew. You can say, we should not have sovereignty, but you don't deny that if there is a people with a connection to the land of Israel, it's the people of Israel. To try to deny that really leads you to very bizarre contortions. So what I found with the young people that over the years I've worked with is they initially give into this dynamic. They hand over a pound of flesh. They'll say, okay, I hate Bibi too, fine. And then it becomes, yeah, Israel is really what it's doing, and this government is terrible. And then you'll be like, yeah, they're kind of practicing apartheid, and what's happening is Gaza is genocidal. And every one of them has a minute, a moment, where suddenly the other side, because the other side is relentless, because the other side ultimately wants all the pounds of flesh until Jews are no longer recognizably Jewish. There is a moment, they can never stop themselves because they operate on behalf of a very deep ideology and dynamic. So there's always a moment where a young Jewish person, I had that moment, suddenly said, you're never going to stop, right? This is never going to be enough for you. No matter how much I participate in these exorcism ceremonies, you always want more. And what I found is that at those moments, when they realize that it's never been about social justice or the Palestinians, or that it was always about the deep desire to see Jews not being Jewish, then they're open. And at that moment, there's books and there's essays and there's videos, and then you can have the conversation. As long as they're In that dynamic, I find that it's impossible to have the conversation. But when something pushes them too far, that they feel it viscerally, that they came to it with the good intentions of doing good in the world and social justice, but this is not what was operating on the other side, that's the moment when you want to be ready. You want to be ready with open arms to understand that at the end of the day, they were victims of a bullying dynamic, and allow them to. Recently, actually, my book of essays, We Should All Be Zionists, was recommended as one of 3 books to recovering anti-Zionists. Like someone who herself described herself this way, she said that it's one of the books that helped her.
So that's a perfect note to open it up to audience questions. So I think we're going to collect the questions.
Yeah. Or if people have them.
And get some other perspectives. And then do you have a question, or are you just holding it?
I do, but I didn't know it was being collected, so the way that it's worded is horrible.
Don't worry about it.
You can correct the wording.
Yeah, you can correct the wording when we
Yes,
ask
if you
it.
like.
All right, don't worry about that.
I can't understand it, I'm so sorry.
Well, for you.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna do what my grandfather used to do when we played gin rummy. I'm just gonna move them around. He always won anyway. Extended gin rummy. Okay. Okay. So. Okay. What would your message to anti-Zionists be? Do they need to forge their ideology and think more practically? Where does, I think you spoke about this, where does the schism in Zionism and anti-Zionism stem from? Like, what, is there some moment in the last couple of years, it seems, having watched this debate for so long, that it has intensified? And what do we think there? Is that social media? Is it COVID? Is it further sort of silos that students operate in? And is it, I'm going to add to this question, is it a lack of actual encounters with anti-Semitism? That we get further and further away for students having experienced directly the costs of anti-Semitism?
Yes, and that's also a point that I neglected to mention in my response to you, is that when all of this exploded on America's elite institutions, a lot of people were shocked. And how could it be that the most educated, the most elite institutions are the breeding ground for that kind of rhetoric and action? And I remember when people expressed their shock, that I was shocked, that they were shocked, in the sense that, again, it goes back to what you alluded to, that we're learning anti-Semitism backwards. We're learning it already as a discredited ideology. We're learning it with the historical knowledge of where it led to. So we assume that it was obvious that this is what the ideology is leading to. It was not, it was far from obvious. You need to have someone crazy like Herzl, and everyone thought he was crazy, to see where this was leading, but everyone thought it was like a marginal idea. So it started among the elites. It gained respectability in the universities. As I said, the University of Vienna, studying law at the end of the 19th century, the Nazi universities in the 20s and the 30s, the German universities with the rise of Nazism. It starts with the elites. But you're right, because we learn it backwards, and we learn it as the discredited ideology that only lives today at the margins of fringe groups of deplorables. Everyone is very smug. It's not just that they're ignorant. Everyone is smug in their notion that they would not touch this ideology with a 10-foot pole because they're educated. They know better. They know where it leads. But they don't understand that the new respectable mask for it is exactly what they're falling for. And it is going and starting with the elite institutions, because without respectability, it can't spread, it can't become institutionalized. and it can't bring down societies. I recently gave a talk to delegations of members of Congress that came to Israel, and I told them, you think you defeated the Soviet Union, it might just defeat you, because it inserted into your bloodstream the ideology that brings down countries, societies, institutions. And if you don't realize it quickly, then it is an ideology, a virus that is known to have driven society mad and to their destruction. You can see it even if you're in your own microcosm of the university. It is a force of destruction. It is not something that is productive. So yeah, I think this is where it comes from. And as I said, I don't think there is something that needs to be said. Sometimes people tell me, oh, these young students, they don't know what they're talking about. They're young, they're ignorant, they just want to be cool, it's trendy. And my answer is, I actually don't care what they personally think or what they personally know, because they are participating in something that is far, far greater than themselves. Over the last decade, I participated in some high-profile debates. Is anti-Zionism the new anti-Semitism? This was before October 7th. It seemed like, a kind of theoretical discussion. I lost all these debates. They would always parade the JVP Jew, which is, by the way, this is why they're platformed. This is why they're important, because they allow to maintain that mask of respectability. Look, it's not about Jews. It's only about Zionism. So, especially after one such debate, where the response of the crowd when it was announced that we lost, and the motion is anti-Zionism is therefore not anti-Semitism, just the glee and the crowd had a kind of pre-pogrom Eve energy to it. It literally felt that they were going to leave the hallways and start, destroying stores. And I remember coming back from that discussion and thinking, this debate, it's not a theoretical issue. It's not like, oh, Beethoven is the better composer than Mozart. Well debated, thank you both. I was like, this is an urgent practical matter. So I decided to investigate what happens in practice, not in theory. What happens in practice to actual Jews when anti-Zionism becomes the governing ideology of a society, of a country, of a political party. And here the historical record is definite. Wherever anti-Zionism rises to the level of a structural ideology, step one, it becomes hostile to Jewish life. As they claim that they have nothing against Jews, they love Jews, right? The Arab world in the 2 decades when it is all organized around anti-Zionism, support for Palestinianism, they claim to love Jews, they have nothing against Jews, all the laws in Egypt and Iraq are against Zionists. But within 2 decades, from Morocco to Afghanistan, no Jews are left. Because first they say they're against Zionism, then they blame the Jews for being Zionists because they dared celebrate Passover, and they said next year in Jerusalem, and that's it. So step one, the environment turns hostile to Jewish life, and if this is not stopped and fought against, ultimately no Jews are left, communally. So I don't care what they personally think. I don't care what the students' personal motivations are. I don't care if they think they're doing good. As I said, of course they think they're doing good because they're eradicating evil. What they're participating in is far larger, far bigger, far more dangerous than what they realize.
Okay, so this goes to our next question. So there are two parts, but I'm going to combine 2 questions. What do you suggest to students who face anti-Zionism in classrooms by teachers and peers? And then a follow-up on this question is about, the campaign for divestment. As you know, Brown University Corporation will be taking a vote on that at their October meeting. And there's another question that says, our university is considering divestment. Can you speak about what will happen if when Western universities support divestment? So these are sort of
Okay.
combined impact on campus life and students.
Okay. So I'll start from the second one. The purpose of divestment has never been divestment. That's not the actual purpose. The purpose is once more to promote the placard strategy, because every debate on divestment includes Israel's committing genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, all that. That's what matters. What matters is to have that debate. Even if it's voted down, it doesn't matter, because already another step has moved forward in even introducing that and even discussing that. Every side now has flyers, op-eds. This is how it works. A lot of the people focus on the specifics. Oh, our portfolio of investments doesn't include this or that company. It doesn't matter. This is not how it works. This is not the purpose. The purpose is to methodically and clearly to create another space where Jews feel unwelcome, where they are forced to choose between handing over another pound of flesh or being ostracized. That's what divestment is for. And once you begin to recognize it, I recently met with someone who works for the pension fund of teachers in Canada. It's one of the biggest investors in Canada. They faced a similar motion. He was very proud of how he was able to handle it. And I remember telling him, you operated on the immediate practical level. You managed to prevent this from impacting your pension fund. But even though they didn't get you to divest, they made progress in their program, which was never about divestment. It's about creating more and more spaces where this idea of Zionism equals evil gets promoted, and where Jews find themselves in an increasingly hostile environment. So that's what's at play. And people need to understand, a lot of people are just focused too much on the details rather than on the big picture. So this is what's happening, and this is why, again, it's in every place. It's the board, the academia, the students. All of these places are more arenas to expand the respectability and the acceptance. And the first question, the one that...
So the first question was, what do we, what do you suggest to students? We have so many more questions to get to.
Okay,
So
I'll just say in a few words.
Yeah.
Once you understand the big picture, I think it must be understood that the choice of being silent and let it pass no longer exists. I know a lot of parents are asking me these days, should we send our kids to these universities or maybe go to other universities where the environment is not so hostile? And my answer is this is a personal choice. If you want to go to less hostile universities, of course, but if you are going to universities where this already exists, go and understand that you will have to fight. So come with a fighting spirit. Don't think that you can now spend 4 years and just let it pass. That option is long gone.
Okay, so this takes a different tack. The current right-wing government of Israel makes the placard strategy much easier to justify. How do you address that?
Like specifically benefits of the air.
Okay.
Right, like what's happening
Yes.
in the West Bank when whole Palestinian villages are burned down and the Israeli police and military are told to do nothing, right? That is a talking point, and I understand we're back in the nuance place, but when you're trying to have conversation, it becomes very hard.
Exactly. So I'll separate it in 2 levels. On the kind of the big picture, it actually makes no difference. As someone who spent 20 years following the placard strategy, following its entry, I can say with complete confidence is that it literally has nothing to do with which government governs Israel, with which actions Israel takes, which is unfortunate because it would have made our life much easier. I've seen right-wing governments, left-wing governments, Israel making peace proposals, Israel not. I've seen all that happen, and the placard strategy continue relentlessly. I remember even a few years ago when there was a moment of lull. No one was dying as a result of violent conflict. And I was sitting in some panel, and there was an anti-Israel speaker, and he said that Israel is committing cultural genocide. And I remember sitting and thinking, what is that even? And then I realized it actually didn't matter, because what they needed to be able to say is Israel and genocide in the same phrase. So I will agree with you that we have the most terrible, I would say incompetent leadership probably in the history of, certainly of Israel, of the Jewish people going back quite a while. But I do absolve them. And again, a lot of bad things are happening, but they're actually not one-to-one. So I do absolve them of the fact that they are helping the placard strategy. If anything, we know that on October 8th, much of kind of the explosion on campuses happened as butchers were still on Israeli territory. People forget that it took 3 days to actually clear the invasion and to push them back. And the reason is, and that goes also to what you asked in the beginning, the idea of October 7th was to serve as an inspiration. Jewish weakness, that's what inspired people. So people will make those talking points, but what I realized over the years is that the big mistake we've made is actually engage on those discussions, thinking that those are good faith discussions about Israeli actions. I made that mistake for many years, and it took me a long time. And I remember when I started telling people, I don't think this is about Israel, which sounded weird because they just said that Israel is apartheid. So of course it's about Israel. And I remember telling them, no, it's not about Israel. It's about creating respectability for the idea that, you know, Jews can go to the Hillel and you can yell Free Palestine at them, and that becomes legitimate. And a few years ago, I came across something called the Brandolini Principle. I don't know if you know about it. Brandolini is an Italian programmer who about 10 years ago, watching the discourse on the internet, coined the principle that also became known as the bullshit asymmetry principle, where he said that the amount of effort required to refute bullshit is at least an order of magnitude greater than the amount required to create it. And I remember when I read that, I thought, that's the Jewish condition. We are constantly taxed with our best people, our best efforts to write books and essays and lectures to explain that it's not apartheid and it's not genocide and it's not ethnic cleansing. And this is what happened. And we're writing all of that. But they were never engaged in a good faith discussion about Israeli policies. I know that because when there's a good faith discussion, it never uses those words. It's always about how can we, and I engage in those discussions in Israel all the time. We try to see how to unseat the government, what to do here, what to change there, what are our choices given that we have an implacable enemy. Does it make sense to retreat from territory if it ends up being Gaza? Those are actual good faith discussions that look at what can be done. But a lot of what you described and what we're facing, that's not what there is.
So I'm going to pivot. Yeah. I have 2 questions that go together, and I have 8 minutes, and I'm determined to get all the questions in.
Okay.
So they go together because given the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship to Zionism's survival, how can American Jews prevent support for Israel from becoming a partisan issue and associated with the right wing of the Republican Party and the Republican Party? So that's one issue. We have a big election coming up, as you know. Iran, and another question, Iran appears to have become stronger in some ways. It's stronger in some ways internally. You could say the economy is is quite stressed there. But can Israel defeat Iran or protect against Iran without Western governments, particularly the United States? And I'm going to add another variable to this, which is that the Republican Party has adopted a clear principle of support for Israel with no qualifications. And they are also buoyed by evangelical Christians who have a strong relationship with Israel. And they are vehemently anti-Iran or anti-Iran nuclear deal. So they have right now a coincidence of positions that make it quite simple for them to profess unfettered support, whereas the Democratic Party has quite a few internal contradictions. So that's a reality. One of these candidates will win the election, I promise. There will be a resolution of this election. And we will have very different regimes in the United States government. How does that affect or impact Israel's potential to survive?
Okay. So one thing we need to know, and it's not really related to any candidate, America will always have a foreign policy and interest that divert from Israeli ones. By definition. And it has nothing to do with how close we are and how big allies and who's in government. And the reason is, of course, that America has Canada to its north, whatever problems it has from Mexico, they're not existential. It sits on the wealthiest continent in the world, and it's separated from the world by 2 oceans. America can afford for a lot of problems to happen in the world and do nothing, make mistakes. America can lose Vietnam and win the Cold War. It could get into Afghanistan and out of Afghanistan, into Iraq and out of Iraq. The mainland will be fine. Israel doesn't have that room to maneuver. Even more than that, America can vote mediocre candidates, weird candidates, anything. America will still be fine. Israel, no. Because we are, unfortunately, despite some good developments in the Arab and Muslim world, we are still surrounded by enemies who, by and large, are committed to our non-existence. We don't have that room to maneuver. This is, by the way, my source of anger for this government, just their complete incompetence and mediocrity given the challenges that we're facing. So I think we need an Israel that goes back to a time where we maintained greater room to maneuver from whoever our ally was. I think over the years we got a little too comfortable resting on American support. We kind of created a defense strategy that was very defensive rather than the earlier days where we tended to go more on the offense, understanding that we can't allow our neighbors to build up too much because we have no depth, we're small. Right, for example, when Iran attacked us and we, together with the US, UK, Saudi, Jordan, we were able to prevent that, what was the American message to Israel? Take the win. And I was like, that's not a win. But the message was take the win, essentially. We don't want to make this any bigger. So all this is to say that America can afford to absorb a lot of things that we cannot. America can wait much longer before it decides that Iran is a real enemy than we can. How we negotiate this, how we manage it, this is why we need top-notch leadership. But ultimately, America, regardless of who's leading it, will always have other interests, greater room to maneuver than Israel ever will. And we need to remember that, and it has nothing to do with how good friends we are, how much of good allies we are. At the end of the day, America can afford things that we cannot. We need to keep it in mind, and we need to be a little more a rogue nation. I think we became a little bit too goody two-shoes for too long a time, actually endangering in many ways ourselves, because again, we have implacable enemies that use are doing this in order to build themselves against that. We need to be much more offensive. We need to be much more aggressive in dealing with challenges and threats before they emerge. This is something that America doesn't have to do, and we need to go back to having a little more maneuvering room.
Okay, I'm going to end with a shorter and longer, and give you a chance to do this. What should, if anything, replace UNRWA?
Okay.
That's one sort of strategic question. And then to finish, if you could comment on the final question, which is the word Zionist has become, quote unquote, a dirty word. That's my quotes adding. What can be done to rehabilitate this term, this concept, this idea? When we leave this room today, what is it that you would want us to think, okay, here's a doable thing, or here's your mission? And so one sort of a practical question, one sort of an ending to the talk.
Okay. So I have about a 30-minute video on UNRWA and its history. I did a briefing in the UN. Of course, there's the book, The War of Return. The short answer that once you understand that UNRWA is the arsonist rather than the firefighter, the question of what will replace the arsonist emerges as weird. Because why would you want to replace the arsonist? You actually want them not to be there. But the answer is quite simply, what will replace UNRWA is Palestinian responsibility. I've always argued it, but certainly since October 7th, I think we can put an end to any notion of the poor Palestinians, the charity basket case. I think we can agree that October 7th required years and massive investment in infrastructure. It required strategy, discipline, economic and financial planning. This is not an incapable people. These are a people with substantial capabilities who tragically for over a century have decided to use them for the singular goal of initially trying to prevent and later to undo the Jewish state. That's the tragedy. So the message should be, you are perfectly capable people. You can build an economy, you can pay teachers, you can have a welfare system. You just need to choose to try to live next to a Jewish state rather than to devote all your capabilities to living on top of it. That's it. So that's the short answer. And if you need more details, there's books and essays. And finally, to the toxification. So over the years, when people said that Zionism became toxic, the implication was because of Israeli actions, Zionism is now a toxic word. And I always said, look, if this were true, then the word Israel would be more toxic than the word Zionism, because the word Zionism would retain its pristine origin as the ideology of Jewish liberation and self-determination, and Israel would be the more toxic word as this ideology gone wrong. But that's not the case. Zionism is the more toxic word. You definitely see it when it's tested. And the reason that it's the more toxic word is that this is the core of Israeli and Jewish strength. Zionism, the ideology of Jewish self-determination, what we discussed, the revolution of no longer being at the mercy of others, this is the idea that gave people the spirit, the ability to fight and sacrifice and go to great length to create and build and defend a state. So I often say that anti-Zionists understand Israel better than anyone because they understand the core of Israeli strength. They understand that our strength lies beyond our tanks and our airplanes and our people. Our strength lies in the idea that inspired people. So you can make this idea dirty and toxic, you can make Israel weak. So the way, and this is why my book and podcast are called We Should All Be Zionists, the young people on campus, many the ones that are recovering anti-Zionists, they started calling themselves Zionists, not because they want to build a state for the Jewish people, because they understood that Zionism is now a shorthand for saying, I'm a confident Jew. Go away, bully. There's nothing to look for here. You can't shame me. Zionism is a path to peace with Arab and Muslim countries and people. This has been the source of hope for me in the last year. Arab, Muslim, and ex-Muslim voices who have spoken up for Israel against our enemies because they understand the conflict, flipping this equation of white settler European colonialist, which are just synonyms for foreign, basically saying, Abraham, we embrace you, you belong here. They're embracing Zionism as a path to peace. Zionism is ultimately a remarkable idea of people saying, we have been dealt the worst cards in history, and yet we are rising for that. We are taking charge. We are not wallowing victimhood. We're taking action to be masters of our fate. It's an ideology of responsibility. I think it's a remarkable idea. And once we understand that it became toxic through deliberate effort to make us weak, I think this is when we can begin to reclaim it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.